South Africa observes Human Rights Day. As I said a little earlier, it's 14 years since 69 protesters were mowed down mercilessly by the apartheid regime as they protested against past laws. We observe the day really to say never again, and we can't go back there. And so as we observe Human Rights Day tomorrow, the question needs to be asked, how is the country faring when it comes to human rights? And we're joined today in the studio, in our Cape Town studios, in fact, by constitutional law expert Phephelaphi Dube. Good evening and thank you for joining us this evening. Many will say that even as we observe Human Rights Day tomorrow, many South Africans are still excluded from the constitutional dispensation, particularly when it comes to the issues of poverty and marginalization. Human rights remains paper thin, they say.
Yes, I would agree with that assessment, but I think it's also important to not lose sight of the gains that have been made since 1992. I think, for example, if we consider the rollout of ARVs in order to combat the HIV crisis, we're seeing that more South Africans are living longer and their quality of lives are being improved. And if we also consider the fact that our infant mortality rate is decreasing, and I think if we also consider education, in the sense that now more than ever, we have more children who are enrolled in schools. So I think here and there are some good stories to tell. But on the whole, the fact that we've got unrelenting levels of inequality, the fact that our levels of violent crime seem to be increasing, all of these then take away from the gains that have been made since 1994.
I mean, if you look at things like crime, if you look at healthcare, if you look at education, there seems for many, many South Africans, as we've just spoken, a disconnect between what the law says on paper and indeed the lived experiences of many, many South Africans.
I would also agree with that assessment, but I think it's also important to consider the role of the state in this regard, in the sense that the Constitution makes it quite clear that the state has a responsibility to respect, protect, and promote the Bill of Rights. But I think if we consider, particularly in the last 2 years, what has been happening in the role of public administration, the fact that we've got state capture, the fact that, for example, with social development and other government departments, that there's been very poor political leadership, and that Parliament, on the other hand, has also been failing in its oversight function. I think we need to lay the blame at the hands of these institutions that have, by and large, failed to realize these constitutional premises.
You mentioned state capture, but there are other scenarios where, for example, the question has to be asked, why is it that in this democracy, learners are still able to fall to their deaths in pit latrines, for example?
That is absolutely inexcusable, considering the fact that the Department of Education about 3 years ago entered into an agreement in terms of which it agreed to be legally bound to certain norms and standards in terms of school infrastructure. And one of those provisions really states that there has to be a proper, or rather a decent level of water and sanitation, which obviously means that there should be no school in South Africa that's still using the pit latrine system. And of course, we also need to consider poor Michael Kopepe back in Limpopo, who suffered the same fate. So all of these events really point to a state which is really out of touch with its constitutional obligations, and it's a pity that we have to litigate these rights in order to force the state to realize these particular rights.
And I suppose even when we do so, there's still the sense that officials can get away with these actions. I think the Life Esidimeni tragedy illustrates this more than most, because, of course, officials, we heard yesterday, acted in the way that they did because they believed, simply, the judge said, that they would not be held accountable.
Yes, it would appear that that is the case. And I think even though the Life Esidimeni Arbitration Award certainly goes a long way in terms of affirming the rule of law, in terms of making it clear just what the role of the state is in terms of protecting its most vulnerable citizens. But at the end of the day, the money that the families are going to be awarded is money that comes out of the public purse. So in a sense, none of these public officials are going to be held in their personal capacities. And unless and until we see some kind of criminal action being taken, which I think, given the allegations of state capture and the erosion of the capabilities of certain state institutions, including the SAPS and the National Prosecuting Authority, at the moment, it's not too clear whether these public officials are going to be criminally liable.
I mean, one of the things that emerged in Parliament today was the Deputy President, for the first time, answering questions, saying that the ANC does not throw its own away, and really coming to the defense of former Higher Education Deputy Minister Mduduzi Manana, saying he shouldn't be abandoned. Now, what message does that send about the seriousness of the ANC and government, I suppose, in general, as far as gender-based violence is concerned, for example?
Well, it certainly does send a very concerning message about the fact that the governing party appears to be putting very narrow party political interests ahead of the interests of the entire nation. And I think we also need to consider certain constitutional demands, namely our foundational values, which demand a government which is open, transparent, and responsive. So in this sense, if we're seeing the governing party failing to hold its own officials accountable, failing to hold its own officials to a much higher standard than that of the ordinary person, it certainly sends out a message that the governing party is only particularly interested in furthering its own interests. And rather, unfortunately, this is to the detriment of the average person.
The land question remains a thorny one, as proposed changes to the Constitution are yet to be clarified. We know, of course, that we're partly here not because the laws were bad, but because maybe some parts of them were not fully implemented. I mean, is the 21st of March a day to celebrate tomorrow for South Africa, would you say?
Well, I think considering where we've come from, considering the very low base in which South Africa was really starting off, the fact that in 1994 a state of emergency had just been removed, the fact that South Africa had just come out of a mini civil war in the 90s, and of course, if we also consider the fact that the 21st of March is really about the 69 South Africans who were killed in Sharpeville, of course, I think there's a lot that we need to be grateful for. I think there's a lot that we need to celebrate. But the point still remains that we can't rest on our laurels. There's still a lot more that needs to be done. And at the moment, it would appear as if the state is failing a lot of its citizens in terms of fulfilling certain key constitutional obligations.
And on that note, we will leave it. There are also those who would say that the Constitution has withstood some of the toughest challenges in recent years. That was Phephelaphi Dube, a constitutional expert, on the line there from Cape Town.